Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Beijing. BRICS countries are some of the worst affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. The bloc set up the New Development Bank, or NDB, as they say, in 2015 to finance infrastructure projects in the developing world. The Shanghai-headquartered bank has pulled its own weight in the battle against the pandemic and help ease its economic crunch. The bank announced $10 billion in emergency aid, which allows speedy COVID-19 related loans. Besides loans, how can international lenders such as the NDB, New Development Bank, help deal with pandemics? How can they lead through a global crisis to play their role? And on that, I talked to Leslie Massdorp, the Vice President of the New Development Bank. In Shenzhen, I'm joined by Leslie Massdorp, Vice President of New Development Bank. Leslie, I know it's a busy day for you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, the BRICS meeting, despite COVID-19 and the pandemic, did take place. What do you make of the significance of this year's meeting?
I think, as you know, BRICS was actually born during the global financial crisis. In fact, the first major summit took place in 2009 in Russia. I think this year probably the meeting characterizes that same sentiment. We are in a very deep global economic crisis, a very challenging external environment, very much like when BRIC was born. So in that sense, it's kind of a little bit deja vu. The more important thing to highlight, though, about this year, Tian Wei, is that it's an expression of how BRICS has evolved and matured. As you know, the meetings of the heads of state is really just a culmination of a whole series of engagements between the five countries. Over the last number of years, you have seen a deepening of the collaboration and the partnership between the five countries in a whole range of areas, in terms of the economy, in terms of finance, security. There's partnerships on health. There's the BRICS parliamentary, the legislatures of the five countries get together. So there's been a whole flurry and momentum of activities between the five countries.
As you may know, Mr. Massdorp, earlier there were already some years of communication and discussion about public health issues. Now, many wonder how better the BRICS countries will be able to have that kind of discussion going on from now on, and also using the momentum of fighting the pandemic together to establish a real platform for future collaboration.
I mean, as you know, BRICS countries have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19. The pandemic started out here in China and then rapidly grew and expanded, especially in countries like India, Brazil, South Africa, as well as Russia, actually. So these countries have each been dealing with this major domestic challenge on the public health front. But there has been also partnerships between the five countries over the last number of years, collaborating, looking at ways of strengthening the public health systems. And I'm sure that when the health ministers met, that they would also have expressed views about how best to learn from each other, because the countries have had very different experiences, as you know. Here in China, as you very well know, China has pretty much managed to contain the spread of the pandemic, and in many senses, China is pandemic-free right now. So there's a lot of lessons that can be shared amongst the countries.
Mr. Massdorp, you and I over the years have been talking about what is on the agenda of the New Development Bank, and we see promises being made, implementations of those promises being done over the years. Now, once again, there is an issue with the world suffering from COVID-19. Economies are looking for new ways to recover. How do you see development banks and institutions like yours will be able to play its role, particularly with the membership that you have right now, who are all emerging economies, who are all somewhat hit heavily, either at the very beginning stage or later, even today, by COVID-19, and who are all struggling at a time when there are enormous amount of debates about multilateralism or unilateralism, protectionism or cooperation. So how do you see this potential?
Thanks very much. As you know, during crises of this kind, whether it's 2008, you can go back and a number of crises, you will see the important role that multilateral development banks play. And COVID-19 is no different. When the pandemic broke out in January, February, all the multilateral banks, the heads of the multilateral banks convened, and very soon thereafter, the new development bank put together a package, a COVID-19 emergency assistance program of $10 billion. So the bank stepped forward, like our peers, to respond to the needs of our member countries. Multilateral banks also, as you know, play a very critical counter-cyclical role, meaning that when you are in crisis, that's when our role becomes even more important. And in this crisis, we have demonstrated that again. So in March, April, for example, we approved our first COVID-19 response loan to China for 7 billion RMB. We then followed it up with a loan to South Africa of $1 billion also to India. And we're now in the process also of doing a second phase of these loans, looking more at economic recovery. So we are now very much focused on assisting our governments to design programs, to design economic interventions, to stimulate economic growth again and to reverse economic decline. And these programs are very much focused on preserving jobs, because that has been probably the single biggest impact of this crisis. It's been the destruction of especially small, medium and micro enterprises, where most of the jobs are being created. So in short, I would say the bank really played the role for what it was set up when the founders created it in 2015.
As you may know, Mr. Massdorp, all over the world there has been enormous amount of debate about, how to narrow the wealth gap and how to narrow the gap of opportunities, how to make sure there's still going to be a free flow of talents, of opportunities. So in the emerging economies, those topics are not smaller than the other countries. So how do you see national governments of your members trying to come up with their own plan, and how will the new development bank, which is a development financial institution, be able to provide the support in that regard, infrastructure of various kinds?
I would say there are a number of commonalities in the way that the 5 BRICS countries have responded to this crisis. Firstly, at the level of sort of broad economic policy design, if I look and read at the statements of the ministers of finance or even the heads of state of the 5 countries over the last number of months, you would see similarities. For example, here in China, when the first discussion started happening about the new 14th five-year plan,
right,
a major emphasis on there is around the inclusiveness of economic growth. Major focus is around sustainability and making sure that we are greening our economy. So major focus is about ensuring that we can reduce levels of social inequality in our countries. And in each of our member countries, you find similarities in that regard, that the gap between rich and poor is something that our economic policies to date have not been sufficiently been addressed. So I think we're going to see the emergence of an economic paradigm that is much more focused on inclusive growth, much more focused on green growth as part of this endeavor of what's called, we need to build back better. We cannot just post-COVID, once we have conquered this pandemic, return to the economic models that we've had before. And that's, I guess, one of the positive consequences of this crisis.
Mr. Massdorp, as someone who's been working for the New Development Bank for years, tell me about what is your judgment, the most important difficulties facing the members of the BRICS countries. Are they about whether they among themselves will be able to come to consensus about the level of multilateralism and the types of multilateralism they want to stick to, given the different politics in different countries, or as a whole, how would they be able to provide the world with a solution coming from economies together, emerging economies together. What do you think is the biggest challenge at this moment?
I think all of our member countries have full agreement on one issue, which is the important role that infrastructure and investment in infrastructure will play and can play in economic development and creating greater economic prosperity. So the building of hardcore economic infrastructure, which is the building of roads and bridges and ports and power, etc., has been central to that agenda. What COVID-19 has done is also just emphasize the importance of public health as probably the central anchor of that, what I would call social infrastructure. Education and health are two areas of major focus for multilateral development banks. So this period has again deepened our belief in multilateralism. It has just reinforced the idea that problems of this nature, like COVID-19, like global pandemics, we cannot solve by ourselves in each of our member countries. It can only be solved collectively. So this idea that we can only resolve problems that are cross-national in character if we work together, if we deepen collaboration, that is something that has been embedded during this period. So I think we will probably emerge out of this crisis with a much stronger, deeper consensus about the importance of multilateralism. As you know, in 2008, the world also faced a major crisis 12 years ago, and we were only able to emerge out of that crisis because of the very strong and powerful role that the G20 played then. Similarly, today, multilateral institutions have to play that role to ensure that we coordinate efforts, that we share ideas. For example, when the vaccine is finally distributed, we need to make sure that this is not just the preserve of those who have the means, and that there is equal, affordable access to the vaccine from especially poor developing countries.
Leslie Massdorp, the Vice President of the New Development Bank, that's a multilateral financial institution established by the members of the BRICS countries. Really appreciate it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.